My name is David Ainsworth. I'm Head of Communications at the United Nations Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Welcome to the press briefing for Thursday, March the 17th, 2022, at the resumed meetings of the Convention of Biological Diversity here in Geneva. So the delegates worked vigorously and rigorously yesterday in all three meetings. Let me give you a sense of some of the things that they worked on. So yesterday, SBSTA, as you may remember, was covering a couple of items. They were doing a decision on health, in particular looking at a plan of action for One Health at the global level. They finished their discussion, and so a paper will be produced that will move forward for further discussion later on in the conference. The SBSTA is still working, however, on the discussion on soil biodiversity. As you remember, agricultural biodiversity includes a lot of different elements. There's a specific report that's coming out from the Secretariat on soil biodiversity. Delegates are discussing that in the annex to there. They didn't get through that discussion last night, and so they'll be continuing to look at those matters further on. SBI spent its entire day yesterday looking at monitoring and reviewing mechanism. Now again, the monitoring and reviewing mechanism, these are the tools that we can use to see how parties are implementing the Convention on Biological Diversity. And then also in particular, as we move forward on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, how will governments show their progress? So the review mechanism includes a lot of elements. It includes national biodiversity strategies and action plans. It includes national reports. It includes other specific tools where parties report how are we doing against this upcoming framework. There are a lot of discussions going on there in terms of the relationship between the global plan and national plans. Do they need to align perfectly, or do parties have the ability to do something slightly different that fits their unique circumstances? There's also the question of non-state actors and where do they report? Can they report directly to the Secretariat, or should they be reporting through national areas? This is a new question because typically under the Convention it's the parties, the governments, that do most of this work. What's different, however, with the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is it is expected to engage a number of stakeholders, and that means that there's that question. So that's still being worked on, and those discussions will continue. The Working Group 2020 continued some of the previous discussions. As you remember, they've been looking at the goals and milestones of the framework, and then also beginning their discussion of targets 1 through 8, and then 9 through 13. So yesterday, they looked a lot of their discussions on targets 9 through 13 and continued it. Again, just to remind you, those targets under the framework deal with essentially sustainable use and questions of sharing benefits. It's about how does this agreement take account of human needs with regard to biodiversity, but in a sustainable way, and then also how can we assure that the agreement makes the question of equity also addressed very firmly in this. So that was the work from yesterday. The delegates will today turn to a number of new matters. So first of all, the Subsidiary Body and Implementation, or the SBI, it's going to turn its work to resources and the financial mechanism. So it'll have a group that discusses resource mobilization. As you may know, for a number of years, there's been an attempt to increase the resources mobilized in support of biodiversity conservation. That resource mobilization happens at multiple levels. It happens at the global level through bilateral lending, multilateral lending, including institutions such as the Global Environment Facility. And then there's also the question of national resource mobilization. And so these discussions are looking at that, and that's always the question: how can more money be mobilized on an annual basis at all levels and in all countries, including support to developing countries? SBI will also look at the financial mechanism. Now, the Global Environment Facility, which is part of the World Bank, is the financial mechanism for the Convention. What that means is that it raises money that it provides to countries in need to help implement their provisions under the Convention. The Global Environment Facility has been increasing in a very tidy way, in a very healthy way, its replenishments or its fundraising in support of the Convention's work. There's a question of timing where the Global Environment Facility's meetings and our meetings are a little bit out of sync right now, but the idea is that we're supposed to send guidance here so that they can identify the way money should be going. So those are really the two items that SBI will look at today. So SBSTA is going to be turning to their look at the monitoring approach. So you remember I said that we under SBI, we were looking at review mechanisms. So the scientific body, the SBSTA, is going to be looking at the science that underpins the monitoring framework for our new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is important because there's going to be an ad hoc technical expert group, so a group of experts from around the world that are going to look at indicators and monitoring and making sure that when we do this framework, the whole monitoring and indicator framework is aligned very clearly with the needs at the global and the national levels, that it's scientifically valid, and that as the targets are negotiated, we make sure we've got the proper monitoring framework. This part's a little bit tricky, and it's a question of how we coordinate. So you're negotiating the targets, making all the elements to them very, very clear, and at the same time, you're also trying to figure out the monitoring framework. So these are going on simultaneously, and they interact with each other. So governments are going to have a challenge for that. But that is what SBSTA is going to be doing pretty much the whole day today on the question monitoring frameworks. The working group on 2020 is going to start working at targets 14 to 21, which deal with really the supporting mechanisms and the framework for implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And so they'll be taking a look at those over the course of today. Let's see, what are the other parts that we've got going on today? So maybe let me just let you know about a couple of side events that will be taking place on site. Unfortunately, those of you who are away from Geneva are not going to be able to take a look at that. First of all, so we're going to have Indigenous peoples and local communities are going to be looking at how they can contribute to these monitoring frameworks as well. So in a side event at 13:15, they'll be looking at their contributions of indicators that look at how we work at the contributions of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So these are indicators about traditional knowledge, really, and their participation. We're also going to have a side event that looks at the landscape perspectives that can be brought into the Global Biodiversity Framework. So remember, you can look at ecosystems, but you can also look at landscapes, and landscapes bring together possibly multiple ecosystems in the same area. So that side event is also going to be on today. The other part that will happen today is there'll be a side event looking at all of the biodiversity-related conventions and their contributions to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. As you remember, while the Convention of Biological Diversity is an umbrella that is meant to cover a lot of issues, there are a number of other multilateral environmental agreements that deal with very important and very specific parts of the biodiversity agenda. So, for example, the Convention on Migratory Species looks at species that move across borders. That's one member of the group. The Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna, or CITES, looks at whether it's vertebrates or timber or anything that's traded back and forth. They're there as well. The Ramsar Convention on Wetlands is part of it. So this side event will be looking at how this agreement is going to bring them all together. And that's important because the previous Aichi biodiversity targets didn't have enough space to really smoothly integrate the work of these conventions. The new biodiversity framework is meant to really bring that all together. So that'll take place. There'll also be a side event on communications in support of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The Aichi biodiversity targets had a target on awareness, but the overall communications framework wasn't particularly well articulated. In the new framework, the idea is that there will be an overarching communication support that will look at communicating progress on the targets and helping to mobilize and leverage additional progress moving forward in that. And then the final side event is one that looks at key biodiversity areas that can help have quality outcomes for the Global Biodiversity Framework. So key biodiversity areas are those parts of the planet where we have identified that they are hotspots or places where there's a great deal of biodiversity, whether it's endemic areas. So the question is okay, how do we make sure that those spots are protected? And how can that ensure that when we move forward in the Global Biodiversity Framework, the outcomes or results are of high quality in terms of making sure we're protecting a lot of these various species. So those side events will be taking place at 1:15. I'm also made aware that there's going to be a presentation ceremony at 1:30 in the main lobby, and it's a presentation ceremony of commitments by non-state actors to the Global Biodiversity Framework. Now that's important. We've talked about it before when I mentioned there was the monitoring mechanism, that the Global Biodiversity Framework is meant to bring on board not just national actors, but subnational actors, business, other stakeholders. So this commitment event that's going to happen at lunch is going to be hundreds of organizations who have pledged to bring commitments on board to this. This is tied to the action agenda, the Sharm el-Sheikh to Kunming action agenda, which the governments of Egypt and China have mobilized in support of it, and others as well. So that'll be taking place here. Those of you who aren't here, you'll be able to see, I imagine, a lot of this on social media and photos that'll also help move forward. I guess the only thing, other thing that I could really sort of mention for here is the meeting continues to proceed. There's a great deal of work. Things are proceeding well, but there's a lot, and there is some concern about how fast we're going to look at moving things. The other thing to note is that there still are a handful of delegates that continue to test positive for COVID-19. So of course, when they do test positive, they have to isolate themselves. And so this is creating a bit of a challenge for the negotiators, because it means that some of the negotiating teams have to participate online. Why that's an issue is this meeting is meant to be an in-person negotiation, and those people who can participate online are supposed to be those who absolutely cannot travel. And so managing that is going to be a bit of a trick. So we'll see how things go on that matter. That's what I've got for you today, a very short briefing. We'll have the Global Youth Biodiversity Network. We'll have a press event over the course of today. And so pay attention to social media and all these things. There'll be another Biodiversity Beat, a news review video that'll come out today, and also some of our interviews that we've done with different actors. So stay tuned, stay in touch, and we'll talk with you again tomorrow. Thanks very much. Take that. Good. How did that sound?